Good evening to you all. Welcome to the shiur for tonight, Sunday of Parshas Devorim. And before we start the shiur, the Rebbe encouraged Siyun v'mishpat tipodeh v'shoveha b'tzedakah. It's a time where we're thinking about Yerushalayim and the rebuilding through Moshiach Tzidkenu. And so the Rebbe encouraged Siyun, the Yerushalayim, Beis Hamikdash, the mishpat tipada, through increase in mishpat and learning Torah, particular halacha, tipada will be redeemed. Veshoveha, and the captives thereof, tzedakah, will be redeemed through tzedakah, and therefore they'll be encouraged to learn extra during this time and to add in tzedakah. So I'm going to start off this year by putting a bit of extra tzedakah, and if you can, on screen, off screen, but just to hisofa in tzedakah, and then we'll go and start our shiur. Okay, so starting off, well, that's just an advertisement. And now one of our listeners asked me for some clarity about the inyan of Peios. What are the areas? What's the area of the Peios, etc.? So we have here, this is from Shulchan Aruch, you can see on the top left. Let's read that carefully. Shiur haPeios. What is the amount which is meant to be left as unshorn? We can from parallel to the hair on the forehead or above the forehead, to just lower than the ear, where the lower jaw starts coming separate from there. All this area, this whole width, should be left untouched. Now, as I'm sure everyone has the same feeling, if you put your finger just parallel to your ear hole, you'll feel that there's a bone there, and that's where your jaw separates from, I guess, the more rigid part of this, the skull. And so that's the bottom, as the bottom line of the Peios. That just where the jaw separates, that's where he talks about here. Lechi hatachton is separating from. The top is from parallel to the hairline. So he's just drawn a, shall we say, a vertical or a diagonal line, and that's the Peios. Now, where would you find the dinim of Peios in Rambam? So this is interesting. The Rambam has it in the dinim of Avodah Zarah, and he explains that the monks, whatever they would be called, the clergy of Avodah Zarah would have a idea of having a round line from the forehead down to the line above the ear. There's no hair immediately above your ear, and they would want to have a straight line. It should be all the way around, a straight line. What interferes with this line is the corner here, which is sticking out. So the priests of Avodah Zarah would make a point of cutting off that piece, so that there should be a straight line from the hairline of the forehead down to the hairline above the ear and going to the back. So this is how the Rambam sees it, and he, as also in Moir Nevuchim, he does go through a numerous mitzvahs to say how they are in place to negate practices of Avodah Zarah. Others disagree to say that the Torah is dictated by what Avodah Zarah, what the Goyim were doing, but that's the view of the Rambam, and that's where it is in Hilchos Avodah Zarah. Fine. So that explains. So what we're seeing, let's see on the upper, these drawings which you have on the screen, these are from the Sefer Nitei Gavriel. There's got a volume about Opshare, and so this is see at the back of the volume has got some diagrams to explain the shiur of Peios. So can you see here? There's one idea that it goes down until in front of the ear, and there's another idea that it goes to the middle of the ear, where as I said before, above the ear there is immediately above the ear there's no hair. So that's basically more a diagonal. That strip, that diagonal, that triangular area would be the area of the Peios. There is something from the Arizal which seems to be a little bit more expansive. The Peios become, I think, more squarish. We'll see that in a moment, yeah? So this is what we have on the left of the screen. We have a quote from Lekutei Torah of the Arizal, not to be confused with Lekutei Torah from the Alter Rebbe. So he talks about this is Parshas Kedoshim, I believe, talks about the Pas HaRosh v'Hazokon. So first of all, about the Pas HaRosh, the payer of the head. So my Rebbe, as in the Arizal, would relieve the width of the tznoim of the temples, shehu kol saris sheyesh min ha'oizen ad shlish ha'metzach, the hair from the ear until a third of the forehead, shehu chelek sheyesh berosh mishnei tzididei ha'moyach, which is on the head on both sides of the brain. Or mafsik bin time. So the way I understand this, although it's not very clear, the way I understand this, and perhaps I've seen this somewhere, that you've got the front and the two sides. So this is the 3/3 of the front of your head. And so you've got the forehead in between, and you've got either side. That's the shlish hametzach. And then that area would be designated as Peios. Shiur. So he seems to be saying that if you take the ear, imagine the ear would go up higher. The way I understand it is not the way it's drawn on these pictures. I understand it's more like a square, that you have the hairline being parallel, being, like how you say, a lateral line, and then you'd make a vertical line as if the ear had gone up. And therefore you create a kind of square over there. And that would be, so again, so the basic halacha according to the Rambam would be just a triangle. And the Arizal adds a bit more like squarish. That's the way I understand the Arizal saying. Now, two little stories. One is that well, here's a question. Is it imperative that when you have a haircut, that the Peios should be a little bit longer than the rest of the hair? Now, the Polish Chassidim and also Chabad Chassidim of old would have a haircut with a zero or a very short haircut. I'm just like to tell you that actually, when I was in Russia, you saw it was very common lahavdil the goyim also to have very short haircuts. If you think about it, it's cheaper. Because so Chassidim would have short haircuts, and so therefore, of course, the Peios are longer. The Polish minhag is to have longer Peios. Now you have the lashon of the Shulchan Aruch, lo tiga boyod. It shouldn't be touched at all. That could be the basis of the minhag of not touching the Peios at all, leaving them grow. Then you've got the Hungarian minhag more to have Peios up until as long as the chin. That's all right. But then what happens if you're not having a zero haircut? You're having a number 4 or something. So is it important for the Peios to be a little bit longer? So I didn't see that by the Rebbe it was visibly any longer. It looked like all the same. So I haven't seen that's any. I can relate to it, and personally I do make a point of having my Peios a little bit longer when I have a haircut, but I didn't see it by the Rebbe. What I heard, two little stories. One is about Reb Motel Kozlina. Reb Motel Kozlina, so a very Chassidish Yid. His father was known as Chaim Zalman. So his code name in Russia was Chazak, Chaim Zalman Kozlina, so he became Chazak. So he was an active member of the Chassidim, and as with many Chassidim, he was arrested and taken and sent to Siberia or wherever it was. Baruch Hashem, he came back alive, and I remember seeing him in Nachal Sachabad about 40 years ago. But whilst he was taken away, so Motel is left a young boy, he's 6 years old, whatever, with his mother, and he needed a haircut. So she was very frightened of the being seen as being obviously keeping Yiddishkeit. So she let the barber give him a regular, very close cut haircut, like a zero, like as I said, was common in Russia. Rabbi Tzin Shem Tov happened to be in the same town, and he sees his friend's son. He says his name Chazak has been in jail. He sees his little boy, and he's got no Peios. He was very, very upset. He's been given a haircut like a goy. So Rabbi Tzin called over the boy, and he got a hold of a razor, like in Russia they call it a britve. And he made around the Peios. He cut, like, you have 0 and you have 000. So he made around the Peios. He cut it so short that the Peios were visible. And in that way, he ensured that this boy had Peios. Years later, Mottl remembered this, and it gave him. There was times where there was a lot of pressure on to remove their beards. Bochrim in Russia was a very big nisoin, and he was under great pressure to remove his beard from Lubavitcher, because they said it was jeopardizing the safety of everyone. And he resisted that to a great degree, and his inspiration was this story with Reb Mendel when he was a little boy, with Reb Tzin, sorry. So that's one story. The other story is, which I heard, I don't remember now from whom, but there was a bocher in Montreal, Lubavitcher Yeshiva. It's probably 60 years ago, perhaps more. And he was in his car. He was not from Chabad home. He was from a Weltischer home. And he had joined the yeshiva. He was happy. But so then some bocherim tried to give him the pressure that he has to have a 0 haircut. To be a Chassidish bocher, you have to have a 0 haircut. He was not inclined that way. And so he didn't, he resisted this pressure, and he said, I'll be by the Rebbe, I'll go into Yud Shvat, we'll never go into Yechidus, he'll ask the Rebbe if it really is that imperative to be a Chassidish bocher to have a 0 haircut. So he went in and he asked the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said, from the Rebbe, dem Shver, habe ich das nicht gehört. That you have to have a 0 haircut, he doesn't have a Masorah that it has to be this way. But das ja. As do and do soll sein dieselbe Sache. Now the length of hair above the forehead, the length of hair at the back of the neck, above the neck, that should be the same length. Not to leave a longer, a fringe, a chup. That the Rebbe said that's important. That was important for the Rebbe. So those are two little stories about Peios. Let's move on. Right. So someone's asking the following. He's finished the Shabbos meal, and he's got now a soup, and he's got chicken pieces in the soup, and he wants to separate them, to put the chicken in one container and put the soup in another container. One has to go in the fridge, one has to go in the freezer, whatever it may be. So for some gashmistic reason, he would prefer to separate them. So does that come under the Issur of Beirut? Actually, it's just interesting. Yesterday, we were learning a Maimer between Mincha and Ma'ariv, Shal Shudah's time, and Reb Naftali Lowenthal was teaching the Maimer. I'm talking about Beirut is only bad from good or good from bad. What about good from good? So in the Maimer, it looks like good from good is not a problem of Beirut. But generally, the Psak Halocha is followed, that sorting out good from good is also comes into Beirut. So in other words, if you've got now, I don't know, let's say you've got potatoes and meat and they're mixed up, and you want to put the potatoes here and the meat there, not for now. If it's for immediate use, that's okay. But if you want to sort them out and put this in the fridge in the meat container, and this in the meat in the fridge in the potato container, that wouldn't be allowed under the rules of Beirut. So the word for sorting in modern Hebrew is miyun. So sorting would also come under the Issur of Beirut, sorting for delayed use, not for immediate use. So here's the question. You want to put the remains of the soup or the cholent, you want to put it into the fridge, and you want to separate the different elements of it. So are you allowed to or not? That's really the question. Yeah? So now let's read from the Sefer Shabbos Halocho from Rav Forkash. So his second volume is mostly about boiler. So he says like this: you've got solid pieces in a liquid. If these are large pieces, which are very noticeable in the mixture, for let's say an egg in water, or a piece of meat, or a piece of chicken, or a big potato in a soup, or you have fish balls in juice, in whatever, fish juice, or if you have a bag of rice, and that's inside the cholent, but the rice is kept separate because it's in this bag. So that's not called taroibet. It's not called a jumbled state. And because there's no jumble here, there's no confused state, therefore, to take them out would not be an issue of boiler. And so even though you have no need for them now, it's for later. So therefore, if you ask a question, can I pick out a chunk of chicken, one mass of chicken from a soup, and to put the chicken in one pot, one container, and put the soup in the other container? The answer is yes, that you are allowed to. If it's a little bit more confused though, now let's say gets into more details. Let's say it was a soup and there's vegetables and chicken. And if the vegetables and the chicken are mixed up with one another, then to separate them, that would not be okay, because they are in a confused state, and therefore to separate them would be under Isur of Baida. Similarly, once you're talking about, let's say, a cholent, which is thicker and bigger pieces, this is where it becomes more complex. If there is a confused state, then if there's a mix-up, and they are kind of one is encroaching from the other, then to start separating them would be subject to the rules of Baida, and therefore you could only do so for immediate use, to take the one which you desire for immediate use, but you wouldn't be allowed to separate them for delayed use. Let's move on to the next question, a totally different field. And here's a story about someone who is called upon to testify, but not in a Beis Din, but in some kind of tribunal. Let's say it could be in a school, about a teacher, could be, and they have information. Of course, testifying is also could be if you testified in a negative for someone, so you're in their bad books. And most of us like to be friendly, or perceive that we are friendly with everyone, so it's not so keen to testify. So there is in the Torah, it says, Im lo yagid v'nosa avoina. If you don't testify, then you're bearing a sin. Now, does that mitzvah, or mitzvah shloisa say, is that only if it's in a Beis Din, or even in another forum where your testimony will make the difference for the defendant, or for the plaintiff, it doesn't matter. So what we have here is on the screen is from the Siman Chof Ches in Choshen Mishpat. That's the beginning, near the beginning of the laws of Eidus. And this piece is from the Ksos HaChoshen. So Ksos HaChoshen is like a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, Choshen Mishpat, very popular in the yeshivas, but this is a fairly simple piece. Now, he writes the following comment. Sometimes Dayanim will say, let's say, very often the case where you've got two litigants, and the only people who can testify, who know anything about it, are people who are relatives, etc. And so they're disqualified to be witnesses. But nevertheless, the two parties, the two litigants, either of them could say, although you are the halacha invalid to be a witness, I'll accept your witness in any case. So, in other words, the one who stands to lose from this can say, you know what, I want to sort this out, and I will accept your witness, even though la halacha, your witness is not valid in our case, but I'm happy to accept you as a valid witness. So says the Ksos the following. Sometimes it says when the Baalei Dinim, when the litigants will accept a korev, a relative, or someone who is otherwise postal edus, and then the Dayanim will sometimes turn to the witnesses and say something about imlo yagid v'nosa avoinoi. If you don't say, if you withhold witness, then you are bearing a sin of withholding witness. And they say, since the litigants have accepted their testimony, so therefore they are considered edim, and hence, if they withhold witness, then they are guilty of to which the Ksos says that's inaccurate, because since la halacha they do not qualify as aid, and it says, he quotes Yerushalmi, if someone will say, all right, I know I need to have two witnesses, but I will accept your witness as if you were two people. Does that mean he has now a chiyuv to come and testify? So he says, so the Yerushalmi says no. So although he's artificially given the status of Adam, of kosher Adus, but he's not, it's artificial, he's not a real aid, and therefore the Gemara says he's not liable of layagid v'nosavoin. So the basic point of the Ksos here is that witnesses who are not valid, or only artificially valid, by consent rather than objectively, they are not considered edus of layagid v'nosavoin. So by the same token, if you are called into a tribunal to testify in a tribunal, that's not a Beis Din. Therefore, you don't really have this idea that if you don't say witness, you are violating. That's not true. Not true. Nevertheless, mihu, however he concludes, true, as in the Aveire of withholding witness, he is not liable, not punishable. There still is a mitzvah to testify. There is obviously a court case, or there's a tribunal, because someone is standing to lose something which they're entitled to, or they perceive they're entitled to. And if your witness is going to either give them what they are entitled to, or save them from being taken advantage of when they shouldn't be taken advantage of. So you are, by your testifying, it's hashavas aveda, you're returning a lost object to them. And therefore there is a mitzvah, not under the title of lo yagid v'nosa avoinoi, but under just generally, if it's an idea that the person stands to lose without you're coming forward, then you have a mitzvah to come forward. Let's move on. Okay. May children play with PlayDough or Plasticene on Shabbos? Of course, the question is also for adults, but the likelihood is the more that children might be tempted. So actually, it just came up with what we were learning yesterday in Shulchan Aruch, learning Siman Shin Yud Dalet. It's a bit unexpected to be there. Shin Yud Dalet is more talking about building with kalim, but it comes up there about using a wax to fill in a hole. So it says one of the things about not using wax to fill a hole would be because of mimareach, of smoothing a surface. Therefore, he says one who spreads, who smooths wax or fat to smooths the surface. Therefore, it comes under the heading of mimamachek, of smoothing a surface. One of the Lamates Malachas. And then he adds, included in this is playing with dough, or clay, or plasticene. Well, that's the Hebrew version of plasticene, plasticene. Right. So then what he's saying here is that making something out of a flexible material like plasticine or like clay would come under memachic, on smoothing a surface. Okay. And then he says, if they would make shape with it comes under another isur of moichik, etc., koisib. But meanwhile, that's the standard psak, that making something out of a clay, etc., it would usually mean smoothing the surface, and therefore it comes under the din of memach. Let's move on. Very good question. Could blue tack be used to fill a hole? Absolutely not. You wouldn't be allowed to put on blue tack on a hole on Shabbos, because you're fixing up the building. You can do better ways, but even that's not allowed on Shabbos. Yeah. Right. Another totally unrelated thing is about names. See? Do you mind? Windows. Okay. Oh, the kids outside are making noise. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid lives about 700 years ago, a bit more, and we have from him, we've gone through this several times, we have various things which he advises and to keep away from, and they're known as Tzavos Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. So what's very well known when it comes to Shidduchim, not to have a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law sharing the same name, not to have a father-in-law and a son-in-law sharing the same name. Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid goes one step further. That's also from Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, by the way. But then he says another thing. If you've got two men who share the same name, they should not make a shidduch of their children together. So you've got Yosef Yitzchok and Yosef Yitzchok should not make a shidduch of their, predictably, Mushki and Mendel. Some say that this is only applicable to mechutonim, for the male mechutonim. That doesn't apply to mechutonos. Now, here we have a letter of the Rebbe. Now, this is in the volume Heichel Menachem, volume 6, and it's the end of a letter. And it looks like there was an elder sister who was also waiting to get married, and there was. My impression is that the Rebbe had a certain apprehension about this shidduch. So he writes, if the older sister has already gotten to a shidduch, or she is moichel, at least she's moichel wholeheartedly, she forgives you to go ahead, then in addition, then it should be one of the mothers should add a name. Because I read in your letter that the name of the mother of the girl and the name of your mother is the same name. So here the Rebbe has kind of invoked this word of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, two mothers of the mother of the Chos and the mother of Kala, if their names are identical, that's an issue. Now, Bichlal, in this whole area of names, of matching names, if one is called, let's say, Arya Leib, and the other one is called Arya Zev, so we don't worry about that, because they're not identical. If one's called Chaya, the other one's called Chaya Mushka, we're not worried about that, because because one's got two names, or they've both got a second name, and they're not identical. That's okay. When Reb Moshe Lando Alav Shalom made a shidduch with his son, with the daughter of Reb Moshe Katzenelnbogen, he was concerned about this, and he asked the Rebbe, and the Rebbe told him not to worry, because Reb Moshe Lando has another name, whose name was Moshe Yehuda Leib. But he wanted to have the Rebbe's, okay. But meanwhile, we're seeing here that the Rebbe, in this letter, does seem to be concerned about the two mothers having the identical name. And that seems to, so although this sefer here, Ziv Hashemis, mentions that some say that with mechutonistas, it's not a problem, the Rebbe does raise it as an issue. But as I say, all right, so let's read a further note in that volume of Shulchan Menachem. That's not necessarily a proof to be machmir indiscriminately. It could be here was a special case. There were other details involved, and possibly because of this is an apprehension to delay the Shidduch transpiring. And that's why perhaps the Rebbe was invoking this inyan. I actually, it's this is something which can be researched. In Chassidish circles, there's so many people who have the same name because they give names of Rebbes and Rebbitzins. My mother was named after the Rebbitzin of the Rebbe Marash, etc. And it's not so far-fetched that you have two Mechotonim and Mechotenistas who are going to have the same name. And did the Rebbe ever not okay? No, we always used to ask the Rebbe's Haskama for a Shidduch. So, Baruch Hashem, there were thousands of Shidduchim happening in Anash. Did the Rebbe ever, I don't know, did the Rebbe ever say not to do a Shidduch because the Mechotonim or the Mechotonistas have the same name? I don't know that information, but I'm sure it can be, with a bit more research can be found out. One other thing is, I just saw, and we'll perhaps come back to that later, there is a svara, there is an opinion that the Savos of Yehuda Chosid was only for his descendants. And even amongst his descendants, that it's only for a particular amount of years or generations. And there was once a meeting, perhaps in Ostra, going back about 400 years ago. And this was discussed. And the Marsha his name is Reb Shmuel Edels. His name is Shmuel Edels. That's Edels is his mother-in-law. She supported him. So he was known as Reb Shmuel Edels. But he stood up and he says, in the Tzavos of Yehuda HaChosid, it says not to give the name Yehuda or Shmuel. I happen to be a direct descendant from Reb Yehuda HaChosid. My name is Shmuel, my father's name is Yehuda. I rest my case that it was not to be applied indefinitely. So there is room to say that the Tzavos of Yehuda HaChosid, or at least some of them, were not made for indefinitely, and so there's room to be makel, and that's why I'm intrigued to know whether this is actually something which I once actually asked Rabbi Heller about this, and he dismissed it. I didn't ask him on what grounds he dismissed it, but possibly he was aware that in Anash families, it's people do make shidduchim even though there are the same names in amongst the Mechotonim and Mechotenistas. So I'm putting it out there, and perhaps we'll get some feedback from some of our listeners now or later. Let's move on. So one of a young Talmud Chochem, a friend of mine, he lives somewhere in the States, and they're doing a launch of a drive to raise money for a communal Sefer Torah. And they write that whoever participates in writing this in the costs is fulfilling the mitzvah of Chsavtem Lochem es Ashir HaZois. You're doing the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah. Now, so he has a problem with the advertisement, because to fulfill the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah, you have to do the whole Sefer Torah yourself. If you bring in other partners, so then you haven't done the mitzvah of Ksiva Sefer Torah. You're not. So he felt that this advertisement was misleading. So I shared with him. There's a fascinating Sikha of the Rebbe, and you can see it's in volume Chof Dalet. And the Rebbe talks about this mitzvah, and he talks about the fact that it's not that it's not common for people to write their own Sefer Torah. It's very much a minority. And why doesn't everyone, if people when they're older or whatever, but why doesn't everyone write their own Sefer Torah? So there is a famous approach of the Rosh, who says that the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah is in order to learn. And therefore the Rosh says that nowadays it's Gemaras, Chumoshim, Sforim, which, of course, he didn't say Shulchan Aruch because it was before the Shulchan Aruch, but he says Sforim which are learned. That's how you'll fulfill the mitzvah of Ksiva Sefer Torah. Fine. So taking that step, or that one step further, in which way do we use a Sefer Torah for learning? We don't use a Sefer Torah for learning Chumash. We don't use it even for Ma'aser Sedra, most of us. So when do we use a Sefer Torah for learning? Aliyah Torah. We have Kriyas Torah. That's when we learn from the Sefer Torah. The Rebbe makes the parallel to the minhag in Europe, where it was difficult to get an esrog for everyone, so there would be a communal esrog. The esrog has to be yours. So the understanding is that there's a community by an esrog, and each time each one picks up the esrog, for that minute, those 30 seconds, the esrog is his. Says Mekai, the mitzvah of L'kachtem Lochem, the minute for that minute is his. So the Rebbe is using a similar idea for the Sefer Torah. There's a mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah in order for you to learn. Well, when you are learning, as in when you have your aliyah in the Sefer Torah, at that moment you own the Sefer Torah. It's not a private Sefer Torah. This is a communal Sefer Torah. So this communal Sefer Torah, so the purchase of this and the commissioning, etc., is so that whoever, whether it's from this community or from another community, doesn't matter, but it's bought for the purpose that whoever has an aliyah, they are going to be actually fulfilling the mitzvah of owning a Sefer Torah for those moments that they have the aliyah. All right. So now, if they write that by contributing to the communal Sefer Torah project, you are fulfilling the mitzvah of perhaps not directly, but indirectly. The fact that you have provided that the community has a Sefer Torah, okay, so then you have enabled that whoever is going to read that Sefer Torah is Mekai, the mitzvah of Chsavtem Lochem es Hashir HaZos. That's the approach of the Rebbe. Therefore, I felt that the advertisement was not totally wrong. Right, now we have a couple of questions coming on the chat. Right, so Rabbi Singer is mentioning that sometimes people add an extra name. That's become quite common now in Chabad. I know at least 4 or 5 people who their name is Mendel, and they're struggling to find shidduchim for their daughters, and so they've added. This one's added a name Meir. This is Chaim. This is Tzemach, etc. So you've got now a lot of Lubavitcher Eden who have an extra name added, but that's usually because of the worry of a son-in-law, and they worried they've got several daughters, and they want to be able to get sons-in-law who might be called Mendel, so they add another name to themselves. That's true. But here we're talking about Mechutonim having the same name. That I haven't heard. Certainly, many people have added so that they should be able to be Mechutonim with someone who has this identical name. Right. So Ari is saying surely that only applies with the person who has the aliyah shared in the cost. Well, so the Rebbe actually says somewhere on the sheet here. That the community are buying a Sefer Torah. They are commissioning a Sefer Torah. And this should be for the community. And Almanas, and the idea is that when a person has the aliyah, like when you build a shul, so you build a shul also to accommodate a person who didn't pay towards a shul. If they're not a paid up member, they come and they use the shul, or they use they would come and use the asterisk. Possibly they would also be allowed to use the asterisk. It's possible, yeah. Right, let's move on. Right. So someone's asking, is it appropriate if women join in with saying Shalom Aleichem and Eshes Chayil? Are they misguided? So Shalom Aleichem, it says, when you're coming from a shul. So if the women have also been at a shul and they're coming home, all right, so then they will also say Shalom Aleichem, makes sense. To the ones who are at home, or they're saying Shalom Aleichem to the Malachim, which came with the menfolk, could be. Bichlal in Chassidish circles, we'd be more careful about women joining in the singing of Zmiras, etc. It wouldn't be done. In Frum circles, but in Ekesha circles, it would be not seen so wrong if the girls would join in the singing. Okay, but that's the cheshbon. Eshes Chayil would be appropriate for a woman to be singing Eshes Chayil. So on a deeper level, Eshes Chayil is referring to the Shechina. But Kipshuta, the Eshes Chayil would be to saying the virtue of his manhood about his wife. So it wouldn't be so appropriate for her to be singing her own praises. So I did look around. I didn't see anywhere this being addressed, whether it's appropriate or not. So let's leave it. I'm more inclined to say it doesn't make sense, but I don't mind being wrong. Well, I did find something in this sefer called Kitzur Shalom, and he says when you go out of shul, go straight home, b'sholem, don't delay, and don't chat Devorim b'teilim, and make kiddush as soon as you can. And he says, this is an interesting thing. He says you should make kiddush wearing the clothing which you wore when you came home from shul, still wearing the shul mantle. So he says some have a minhag that they come home wearing their coat, a special Shabbos coat, I guess, which they called the shul mantle, shul coat, and they would wear that until after they made kiddush. So I believe in Polish circles this is observed. I never saw this minhag, neither by my father or Shalom, by my shvel or Shalom. So, there are communities who have this minhag to insist on wearing their clothing from shul till after kiddush. And perhaps if they wore a talus, perhaps they'd wear the talus also. I don't know. The only time we wear a talus, well, Motzi Yom Kippur, there is an Indian dafka wearing a talus in your kittel when you make Havdalah. That's something which is in our minhag, yeah. Right. What is, I think, again, emphasizes the famous brisa about the Malachim coming home with a person, and if they see everything is nice and bright and everything is in its place, so the good Malach says Yehirotzen should be the next week the same. So that's a point which should be emphasized, that the home should be ready, everything should be in place and neat, so that when the husband comes home, then you get the brocha from the Malach gives the brocha. It should be the same for the coming week. Someone's put here a point. Should a single woman who has not been to shul say or sing Shalom Aleichem? So there's nothing. It seems to be more to say no, but if you there's no harm. There's not a bracha which should be said in vain. So if you feel that you want to sing Shalom Aleichem on your own, you can do so. But see it as not as a obligatory. It's just if it sets the mood for your Shabbos evening, fine. Okay, let's move on. Right. So someone asked the question: is it okay for the kala, for the bride, to give the groom, to give the chosen a ring? Is that very wrong? Is it? So the way I understand is that the ring, I'm talking about from a Goyish perspective, that the ring is an expression of a commitment. And when the man puts a ring on the wife's finger, even an engagement ring, it's like similar to the concept of Kiddushin, that you are consecrated to me to the exclusion of anyone else. And certainly the wedding ring, that she's married to him and not to have a relationship with another man. So in the not from circles or not Jewish circles, the Havdil, it's common for a woman to give a man also a ring. So that is also to say That's his commitment that he's not going to have relations in a wrong way with another woman. So that seems to work. Now in Torah, that doesn't exist in original halacha, because as we know, the Torah allows a man to have more than one wife. Therefore, that commitment doesn't have a strong. Of course, we have now, since Rabbeinu Gershom, last 1,200 years approximately, that the Ashkenazim for sure don't have, or that a man should have more than one wife. But to say that as a halacha, that a woman would put a ring on the husband's finger and as a result he is bound, that doesn't have a background in halacha. In the letters of the Frierdiker Rebbe, you can see it's volume Ches. So he was asked by, I think, Rabbi Hecht in Chicago, or Schusterman, one of the young Lubavitcher Rabbanim in Chicago, and where he asked what should he do when the Kala wishes to put a ring on the Chosen's finger. So he says, in your meetings before, you should explain to them that this is better to do not during the chuppah. You'll do it afterwards in the yichud room. You have a moment where you break your fast, and that moment, that's where you give you'll give the groom, you'll give him the ring, or mishi yakabel. Hopefully, I think he's saying it's not something to make a massive fight about, but that's something which you recommend, that the woman giving the man a ring can be done at a later point. It shouldn't be done as part of the ceremony of the Seder HaChuppah. Let's move on. So someone asks me the following. Bit of an interesting question. When we do a mitzvah, we have to do so with the intention to do the mitzvah. So we have a mitzvah to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Mitzrayim. How do we do so? How do we do this mitzvah? So we say Shema, and the third parsha of Shema, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, Asher Tzeisi Eschem Me'eretz Mitzrayim, Yesh Lachem Le'Elokim, Ani Hashem Elokeichem. So we mentioned about Yetzias Mitzrayim in the last verse of the last paragraph of the Shema. What happens if, when you said the Shema, including this last paragraph, your mind was not thinking about Yetzias Mitzrayim? You said the words, whether you thought about the translation of the words, but you weren't thinking, I'm doing so in order to fulfill the mitzvah. So this is the question: Am I Yotze? If a minute later or 10 minutes later, whatever, I realized, oops, I was daydreaming when I said the Shema, the last part of the Shema, do I now have to repeat that passage in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Zchiras Yetzias Mitzrayim? That is the question. So I was introduced to a sefer called Torah's HaMitzvahs. It's very much a contemporary sefer, but he's exploring, very, very beautiful, how he explores the underlying principles, which will be common to many mitzvahs. So there's a whole, actually the first one is all about the kavonas mitzvahs. So let's read what he has over here. If you did a mitzvah and you didn't have specifically in mind to do this for the mitzvah, but from the context, it's understood you did so out of duty. So some say that you are Yotze regardless. So his source is Chai Odom, says it says if you're reading Shema because you're studying, you're reading Chumash and you said the Shema, or it says if you are blowing shofar just for making musical notes, so then you didn't have in mind to do the mitzvah. What happens if you are reading Shema? So that's how it says in the Gemara. So they've illustrated he's done so for a totally unrelated purpose. What happens if it's closer? He read the Shema as part of Seder HaTfilah. He ate matzah, part of the Seder, the shofar. He didn't have in mind, I'm doing this, the Shem mitzvah. He did it because that's part of it's on the schedule. So he understands the Chayodam misunderstanding from this. So since he did so because this is on the agenda for today, and the agenda there is to fulfill the mitzvahs, so even there wasn't a direct, specific kavanah to do the mitzvah at that moment, the being in the context of doing it out of duty is enough to be yotze the mitzvah. So that's the generally put. And therefore, he goes in a later chapter, he talks specifically about Shema, that it would be imperative that you understand, you're conscious of the words which you're saying. But still, he takes the view that so long as it was within the context of davening, so even if you didn't have a specifically kavanah, I'm doing so the shame mitzvah is chiras yetzias mitzrayim, you'd also be yotze. You wouldn't have to repeat. I'm happy to do I'm sure it's a very common experience of people not fully concentrating, and that should be okay. Now, the last point which I have on the list, or second last point, is about the bracha on crackers. I think we've discussed this before, but it's come up again recently. Now, you buy these crackers, and they have a nice hechsher, a good hechsher, whatever, and it says on it, and then someone tells you, but according to the Alter Rebbe, it's hamoitzi. So I'd like to just address that, because I'm perhaps as my disposition. Instead of saying everything we're different, there are things which we agree. Yeah. Now there's a concept in Gemara called pas habo b'kisnin, and there are three translations of pas habo b'kisnin. One says it's bread which is nibbled. That's defined as a bread which is made with flavoring, whether with sugar or with egg, whatever it may be, a flavored bread. That's a snack. It's that kind of snack bread. The second one is a pas habo b'kisnin pouch. It's a filled bread, so like a strudel or something like that. It's baked with a filling, and it's a sweet filling. So it's not kind of thing which people will have for their main meal. Therefore, it's misguided. Then we have the opinion of Rabbi Hai Goren. Rabbi Hai Goren says that what does it mean? Pas habo b'kisnin kachin dakin. It's thin crackers. So he says that thin crackers are misguided. This Rabbi Hai Goren, these three opinions are brought in the Shulchan Aruch. I think it's Siman Kuf Samach, and the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch also brings it. The mystery is that in Hilchos Birchas Hanehenin, in Perek Beis, where he talks about the definition of bezonos, so he brings two opinions of pas habo b'kisnin, and he misses out the opinion of Rabbi Hai Goren. He misses out this opinion that crackers are by default are bezonos. So Shulchan Aruch and all other poskim say this, that cracker is bezonos. So why does the Alter Rebbe leave it out? Obviously, he didn't agree to it. Rabbi Hai Goren, I disagree with that, because Rav Hai Goren, being who he is, on the Goinim, and is brought in Beis Yosef, brought in Shulchan Aruch, just to dismiss, we don't paskin like Rav Hai Goren, very, very difficult to say. So the way I understand is the following: that not that we don't paskin like Rav Hai Goren, it's just that there's something very significant changed, and that is that Ashkenazim, for the last 400 years, let's say, have been making wafers, thin crackers for matzah for Pesach. Before, the matzah used to be thicker, used to be softer, and then it became a standard that Ashkenazim have got these hard, thin wafers or crackers used for mitzvahs matzah and used for hamoitzi over Pesach. And as many of you know, that the Sfardim will, on the whole year, on regular machine matzah, whatever, they will make beide minim bezonos. It'll come Pesach, it'll become hamoitzi. Now that's an interesting approach, and it's a bit of a difficult one, because how can you say that this is a bread that people are not kovei asur, not using it for a meal? There's a week and more, 8 days a year, where this is your bread. Therefore, the Alter Rebbe could not bring down Rav Hai Goren in the Siddur, which the Shulchan Aruch was more, registering the opinions and the positions which are written in poskim. The Siddur was much more practical. So he says, I can't bring that to say that on thin cracker it's bezonos, because that's the kind of, okay. So now, therefore, so a machine matzah, It's going to be hamoitzi, because it's on Pesach, it's a bread. All right, so now where I do have a problem is like a tea matzah. So a machine matzah is, let's say, 5-inch square. A tea matzah is 3-inch square. So how do I draw the line? When is it called a cracker? And when is it? I don't know. That's a difficult one. But when it's something, let's say breadsticks, pretzels. Pretzels are also made of flour and water. Why pretzels mizonos? Because no one has pretzels for lunch. It's not normal. And this is the position of Rav Hai Gaon. That's something which you're not kover suda, because it's a thin kind of thing. So then it's a thin kind of bread, a thin cracker type of thing. It's therefore it's a snack food, and therefore it's mizonos. And therefore, with these crackers which are made with a bit of sesame oil or whatever it may be, some other ingredients, if it's just a plain tea matzah, I would agree with the Rabbanim who have their reservations. But when it comes to, if it's flavored with something else, and it's clearly the kind of thing which people don't have it for a meal, it's just had as a snack, then I would rely on Rav Hai Gaon, even though the Alter Rebbe doesn't bring in the Siddur, as I think that's the reason why he didn't, because of the regular matzahs. One last thing, and that is feedback about the story of the Zayda who was asking whether he could be sandik a second time. So after I spoke about this, I think 2 weeks ago, so someone sent me a 4-page tshuva from Rav Oberlander in Monsey, and he goes through carefully through the Noda B'Yehuda and the Chasam Sofer, which we discussed then. He also brings the story which I mentioned of Reb Chonya Morozov, how the Rebbe Rashab was sandik by one of his sons, and with the next son, he gave the sandakoros to the son to the previous Rebbe, and then the Rebbe Rashab asked him what happened here, and the Rebbe Rashab, and he said because he didn't want to give sandak to the same person twice. So the Rebbe told him that is only applicable when the covered is for the sandik. But if it's the covered for the child that so-and-so is his sandik, then the union of giving sandakoros twice isn't a problem. Now, that's a well-known story. With the details are updated last time. I found the whole story very interesting. The Rebbe Rashab is kind of asking, why didn't you give me sandakoros? It's very strange. I think he was actually wanted to avor, not so much, why didn't you give me sandakoros this time? The Rebbe Rashab knew that his years are numbered, and he was saying in the future, when even though you've given my son this time to be sandik, that's not a reason not to give him sandik next time, which indeed that's what happened. The next boy was born after the Rebbe Rashab had passed away, and the Rebbe Rashab had kind of, with his conversation, clarified, so you can give it more than once. Now, so possibly in this case, because it's a Zayda, the case which Rabbi Oberlander was talking about is actually the father was unwell, and therefore he wasn't able to be there, and it was a bit of an emotional situation, and therefore he's trying to accommodate that the Zayda should be able to be there. And is it a covet for the child that the Zayda was his sandik? I think that would be legitimate. So he finds a way of being matir. So I just wanted to share that with you, although I had taken the position that the Zayda should decline to be a sandik a second time. But then he also quotes, which I'm sorry I didn't look this up. He quotes from an answer of the Rebbe, that someone asked this question about being sandik a second time, and the Rebbe had said, as Ms. Mechaber, if you are being honored, you should accept it. He quotes it from a journal called V'hoir Eineinu B'Seirosecho, and that is where the yeshiva in Morristown had taken all the ha'oros which had responses from the Rebbe. Morristown Yeshiva gives out ha'oros at Tmimim, and over the years there had been many answers of the Rebbe in relation to ha'oros which have been written in their in their regular koivers, and so they put them together in this volume of Hoyer. So it's something which I should have looked up. I didn't. So there is an answer of the Rebbe. If someone gives you the covet of being sandik a second time, you should accept it. I don't know what the circumstances are. It could be that this was a Rov, and it was mentioned last week for some sofer, a Rov, like a Kohen Gadol can do Ketores a second time. So to a Rov can also be a sandik a second time. So it could be that was the question. I don't know whether the Rebbe was ready just to dismiss a minhag which is written in the Ramah and written it goes back to again to Sefer Chassidim. So just to say that it's not a problem, I find that difficult to believe. More likely there was something about it, and the Rebbe saw the need or saw the justification that the person should be allowed to be a sandik a second time. Just in case you haven't seen this sefer of the 10 shiurim put together in English, in 100 questions, is available on Amazon. And someone told me he just got his delivered just this evening. So enjoy, and thank you all for joining us, and I wish you a good evening, and everyone should be well, and we should be zecher. As I said, I started with Tziyam b'mishpat tipode, Shaveh b'tzedakah. We should be zecher to see v'sechazera ineinu b'shuchol tziyam merachmim with Moshiach tzedkeinu or Malkeinu v'Reisheinu. Good night.
Good night.